certainly help. I'm going to move right now, past the town manager's report for a second, while we wait for Beth to join us, and I will go to the licenses. So we have a common victual license renewal for Cup 89. Is that right, Patty?
Yes, it is. It's just approval of it, accepting it.
Okay.
Jen said everything's all set.
All right. So is there a motion? Any discussion about this? All right, hearing none. Is there a motion on the license?
I move we approve the common victual license renewal for Cup 89.
Second.
Roll call vote. Mariano?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Anthea?
Yes.
John? He votes yes with a thumbs up, and I vote yes as well. All right, great. We'll go to our business agenda, and then we'll come back to the town manager's report. I think at this point, I see Jay Tallerman here. I think Ian Gillespie is here as well. Why don't we go to number 2? And Peter, I'm just gonna keep you waiting for a couple of minutes.
Sure, no problem.
And Mark to join us. Why don't we go to the 10 Converse NOI request? So, oh, there's Beth.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So Beth, I thought we'd start with the 10 Converse NOI request tonight.
Sounds
since we
good.
have all those people here. So I don't know if you want to just remind the board where we are in this process, and then we can go
Sure.
from
Yep. So Ian Gillespie is here. It was the applicant for the 10 Converse Place project. He presented at the last board meeting about their desire to make some improvements on the adjacent town-owned property along Mill Pond, between the Mill Pond and the 10 Converse Place building. And so there were, I think, some questions raised about the whether that work was being used to kind of offset some of the impacts on their own development site, if that was being used as mitigation, and what the kind of long-term implications would be for the town's use of the property if that was the case. And in the meantime, the Conservation Commission denied the order of conditions. I think it was maybe a week and a half ago for the project. So anyway, prior to the denial, I sent the information to town council for his review and thoughts. So I don't know if you want to hand it over to Jay or if you want to take it from there.
Yeah, Jay, why don't, if you have anything to add to what Beth has stated, now would be the time. Where'd Jay go? Oh, there he is.
No, not too much to add. We, the denial is the denial, and obviously we might all have some thoughts on that we would discuss in a different forum. But as to the NOI with respect to town property, it seems straightforward enough because it appears as though there would be some work being done with respect to some areas to restore some areas owned by the town. However, given the status of that area as riverfront, that restoration, if it is done, would kind of be locked in at the end of the process through a restriction on any future use. So the hesitancy, and I think this is what we've been trying to figure out, is if the town has contemplated any additional work or any further future projects adjacent to the resource area, then it's possible that it could be affected by taking part in this process. So, which isn't to say that we're not interested potentially in having the property restored, but it does provide a limiting factor to the future of the property that I think the board should weigh in on, as it's property under their control.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, Jay, what you're saying is once these improvements are made, they're done in perpetuity and you can't make any further improvements? Is that what you're saying?
That's the letter of the requirements under the regulations. It's unclear to me. There's not a particularly frequently invoked provision of the Wetland Protection Act. It just doesn't come up that often, but it is possible that perhaps that the restriction could reflect the opportunity to do further work, but we can't guarantee as either staff for the town, and you can't guarantee as a select board that the Conservation Commission might essentially freeze that area in place with no further work to be done. And restrictions in an order of conditions are essentially perpetual by operation of law through a few various cases and the wetland regs.
Okay. So at this point, I'd ask Ian if you have anything to add, and then I'd open up to board members for questions and discussion. Or Ian, someone from your team.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we have Larry Beals with me, who somehow got identified as Ian Gillespie. So there are two of us apparently on your screen. But I think, and I deferred to Attorney Teleman's knowledge, but we see it simply as improving the riverbank. We've wanted to do it since we bought the property. We just were following, we had talked to the Concom about the Arizona initiative there. They had asked us if we'd be interested in doing it. We said, of course. It's part of, it feels as though it's part of our landscaping, although you own it. So we had seen improvements there as part of our landscaping improvements in the future, but we can't do that without your permission and the permission of the Conservation Commission as well. But I think that's true. Maybe Larry has a better understanding, but I thought this was just about plants. So I didn't understand it as a use restriction. I understood any uses or any work on this land in the future, of course, would have to go before the Conservation Commission anyway. Larry, is that roughly your understanding?
Yeah, a couple of factors to consider. One is the land already under the Conservation Commission has a 25-foot no disturb. So it's restricted against any development per se. There's a lot of discussion during the permit process about how the entire embankment around all of Mill Pond has been disturbed over the years. There's rock riprap has been placed, granite blocks, which has hurt the ecology. And, you know, if you think about an ecosystem like a pond, the most important, the most valuable parts of it is edge habitat. You know, the edge of the ocean, the edge of the forest, the edge of the pond. And I think we can accomplish two things. We can make it look a lot better. We can remove all the invasive plants that are currently growing out there, and we can restore the ecology. And then in terms of future projects, in round numbers, I think we're fixing about a third of the pond. So if the town had another project with more mitigation, all of the pond edge has been disturbed, and it might be a nice goal to for the town to consider restoring the entire pond. But we can certainly do about a third of it with this proposal.
Okay. Anything else, Ian or Larry, before I open up to board members?
No, thank you.
Okay. Board members, any questions? Discussion? Don't all jump at once. I guess, I mean, I have a question. With the denial from Concom and no development occurring, I guess, why is this ripe now for us to reach this decision?
Is that a question for me? I might answer.
Or anybody who can answer it for me.
Well, for us, we've always wanted to clean up the edge of the pond, but the logic was to do it. We knew we were going to be doing landscape plans. It's not a tremendous amount of work. It's pulling out the invasives, and Larry could define it better, but reseeding with the appropriate mix. So it's not a tremendous amount of work, but we are there. I know the town has done some work there with some minor tree plantings. Unfortunately, they've also done some work there with bark mulch, which is full of invasives. So we would hopefully change that pattern. But just as a part of our normal landscaping plan for the existing property, we would like to be able to help that pond bank. So we've always assumed that. We just thought the timing would be appropriate with the other notice of intent.
All right. And Beth, correct me if I'm mistaken, has the Concom weighed in on these plans at this point on
I'm not sure how much they've waited on the plans, other than I think to advise them that they needed the town to sign off as applicant on the notice of intent.
okay. Anyone else?
Rich, if I could just add one thing, one member of the Conservation Commission is a key member, I believe, in the Aberjona Initiative, and provided a lot of good ideas. And I was not present, but I know he met with the team's landscape architect and reviewed the plant materials and recommended some adjustments which were incorporated into the plans. So to some extent, the Conservation Commission has reviewed the plans.
I think the concern is probably less of the landscaping work itself and more of the possibility of this encumbering the lands if it was to be counted as mitigation for the larger development on the site. I think that's, you know, the landscaping piece is the kind of easier part of it to work out. It's kind of the long-term implications for the town-owned property if it is linked as a mitigation measure for the development.
And would that affect the current bike path, Beth, that goes through that?
Well,
area?
I would defer to Jay, but I think it would affect our ability to make changes out there, right, in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't affect the existing conditions. I think it would, within the area of work that they're doing, it might hamper future alterations. So to the extent that there is an existing bike path out there, I think that that's okay. To the extent that it's rerouted for additional improvements out there, then it could, you know, it certainly could run into at least a discussion as to whether or not that is affected by the restriction. I hear what Larry is saying, and I agree with what Larry is saying in large part, and Ian as well, that there's really, that their goals are certainly altruistic, it appears, and there's not a super risk of long-term major implications in that we're really restricted as to what we can do out there. I suppose during the Conservation Commission proceeding, there could be some discussion as to what a restriction may look like on the back end as to whether or not it would prohibit maintenance of the bike path and the accessory elements thereof. But the project itself certainly tips into that area of requiring in the Conservation Commission's eyes and per the regs, some kind of restriction on that back end.
Okay. Thoughts of board members? Is everyone comfortable with this?
So, I mean, one thing that the letter says all work will be done in conjunction with the adjacent project proposed at 10 Commerce Place. Given that that wasn't approved, you know, what does that do to this NOI that we would be voting on?
Well, in theory, we continue, Mariana, to maintain our own landscaping out there. So to the extent we have people out there, we can pull in, as I understand it, and again, Larry can tell better, but getting rid of invasives is, I believe, a multi-year process. So it's the kind of thing that you pick away at. You get rid of them, they come back, you get rid of them again, kind of thing, and you plant new. So we had actually postponed this because we thought it was part and parcel of the other. And Jay, I would have thought that if you wanted to do any work out there again, you could file another notice of intent, couldn't you? But it doesn't really matter, but we just thought we'd go ahead and we had
Right.
talked about the Arizona initiative. Let's go ahead and get it done.
You're 100% right, Ian. As is, we could file a notice of intent. Obviously, we'd have to deal with the limitations of work within a riverfront, but limitations of work within the riverfront, which are certainly rigorous, aren't the same as a recorded restriction that actually prohibits any work. So, in terms of an order of magnitude, restrictions on a piece of property can be pretty significant. We can work in and around a regulation against the Concom that our work will be consistent with the interest protected by the Riverfront Act. But if there is a restriction against doing any work, we don't even get past go. So, and again, I think the risk is low, given that new projects in that area of any kind of substance are not likely to be particularly warmly received under the Riverfront Protection Act. But the restriction is something that the board should at least keep in mind as they make a policy decision.
And we were not proposing a restriction. So if there were a restriction, that would be proposed by the Concom?
It's mandated under the regulation. The way the work was described in the NOI, I think the terms of restoration were used in and around mitigation, and it tipped it in. Then I reviewed the NOI a little more closely, and I think word choices could have some import, but it looked like it meet the elements of the regulations for restoration of degraded riverfront, wherein the imposition of a restriction is almost mandatory. What that restriction says, I'm not exactly sure, but it could be everything from never go near it again to only restricted in certain areas. But the requirement for restriction in that instance would be mandatory at the end of the project through a certificate of compliance.
So I guess for me, there seems to be a lot to unpack in this little project. And I can appreciate the offer from Ian and his team on this, but at the same time, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with that area and that lot at this point. And as Mariana stated, the letter said it would be done in conjunction with the development. So although it's remote, I'm just a little concerned that we don't know what the development will be, if there will be development or anything over there. So I guess I would kind of like to see how everything plays out, if there's an appeal or that process plays out before we decide this, only because I think the two are linked and we would see the totality of the project. But that's just me. I don't know what others think.
Rich, could I address that?
Sure.
The notice of intent that the board has seen and that I believe Jay looked at was a draft, and it was drafted prior to the most recent Conservation Commission decision. And it was only intended as a draft. And if there's a concern about it being linked to the other project, we can make the document stand alone. And we've always viewed it as it's a notice of intent for the restoration of that pond embankment. And there's a pretty clear separation. The town owns the property, the developer does not. It's regulated by this board. It's also regulated by the Conservation Commission. And we can unlink it. At the time, it was viewed as a good thing to have it tied to the project, because then there would be some symmetry between the Aberjona initiative and what's going on the 10 Converse property. If the board has the concern that you just expressed, with the draft that we submitted, we can change the language to really make sure it's clear it's uncoupled from the adjacent project.
Okay. I don't know if the board has that concern. I guess I was just expressing my opinion, so I don't know what.
I mean, Rich, I would just add to that. I think in that Concom has sort of stopped that project as it was planned, that I think that it creates a complication. So sort of in agreement that maybe having them separated just might make it clearer. But also just to question maybe for Jay for clarification from Beth's point about the bike path. I think we would just want to make sure that there's not a restriction on any sort of rebuilding or things that could need to happen in that area if something were to happen to the path, but then it would be not able to be repaired.
So the restriction, as I understand it, would apply to the area that is being either mitigated or restored or whatever. Again, the regulation doesn't particularly give much more detail than that. I don't know sitting here where exactly the bike path is in relationship to the restoration work that Ian and Larry are proposing. And maybe that could be refined so that it wouldn't even be considered there. But as I understand it, a pretty strong restriction is generally mandatory in the area that is the subject of that NOI. So what that looks like, I don't know. And how that may affect a relocation of the bike path, I can't tell because I don't know where that bike path is in relationship to the restoration work that they're proposing. You know, they can't retroactively restrict our use of the bike path, but a relocation or adjacent amenities in the restoration area could be potentially affected. Again, maybe not, and maybe that all can be designed around. I'm just not knowledgeable enough of the particular area to feel confident in giving an opinion. And maybe this is just evolving, I think, as Larry suggested, that maybe the next version of this narrows the discussion and perhaps we could get some clarity from the Conservation Commission pre-application even that as to what we're looking at there. So we can get some good work done on restoration, but not otherwise impact our ability to maintain a pretty important resource over there for bicyclists and pedestrians.
Okay.
So I could provide some clarification on that. Maybe we haven't been good at expressing what we're trying to accomplish, but the work, if you're familiar with the area or if you've walked down the bike path, as you face behind, it's very level. And then there's the top of the embankment, and then it pitches down at about a 1-to-1 slope. And the work that we're proposing to do is from the top of the embankment to the water's edge. So bike path is separate from that. It's offset for quite a distance. And if you were to go out there tomorrow, you can tell the area where we're proposing to work because it's on a slope and it's all brushy because it's an area that's a challenge to maintain. So there's no work proposed in any of the lawn area or the bike path area or any other part of the town property, other than that embankment that surrounds Mill Pond, adjacent to 10 Converse.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying. Do board members feel like they have enough information to vote on this tonight? Is there a motion? Is there more discussion? What do we want to do with this?
think we should.
Rich, if I could be so bold, maybe we forestall this and we get Larry and his team to kind of refine what we're looking at. I don't know what kind of time pressure you're feeling under Larry and Ian, but maybe we just need to know a little bit more so we could flush out exactly what the implications could be for areas that we may preserve for future use.
Jay, we're not under any time pressure, and I think your suggestion is excellent because we would do that anyway. What we put together was a draft with the expectation that it would be vetted by you, Beth, anybody else that has an interest in it, finalized, and we need to make the town comfortable with the content of that notice. So that the select board can either choose to sign it or not sign it. And if the board signs it, I'm assuming it would be based on your recommendation, Jay, Beth's recommendation, and anybody else that has input into it. So we have time, and frankly, some of the comments that you've made make a lot of sense to me, and we should revise them anyway.
I would agree with that. The irony is we were approached to help with the Arizona initiative. So we were trying to do the Arizona initiative along the pond. But we're not under any pressure, any time pressure, and we certainly don't want to make the select board uncomfortable with our suggestion that we go ahead and do that work.
Okay, well, we appreciate that. Is everyone okay with following council's recommendation and Larry's recommendation?
Yes.
Kind of revise this and taking it up on another date?
Yeah.
All right. So at this point, I think we'd take no action on the request and have you go back, revise it, get the stakeholders' input that you're referencing, and then we certainly consider it at that point, if that makes sense.
Terrific, of course. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on, let's go back up to Beth's report under the town manager's report at this point.
Sure. And share my screen here. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
So just a couple updates. The board reviewed the outdoor dining policy earlier this year. We finalized the document. The outdoor dining season will run from April 10th to April 15th. Applications are currently available in the town manager's office and are due February 16th, with the goal of the board reviewing them at your meeting on February 27th. Next up, I just wanted to mention that the town just received our 5-year cycle verification for our this program. It's a voluntary program that we participated under the National Flood Insurance Program with FEMA. It's called a community rating system. We started this program when I became town engineer about 12 years ago. And we just recently, because of the activities that we're doing, just got a class improvement because of some of the stormwater regulations that we put in place. So now our residents will receive a 20% discount on their flood insurance premiums because of our participation in that program. So I think it's been a great program overall that we've been able to run and help our residents with their flood insurance costs.
Absolutely. Great work.
Thank you. As we talked about before, nominations are now available for the March 18th annual election. There's several positions to be filled that are listed here. Today is the last day, so I guess it's a little late to pull nomination papers. Hopefully some people saw this before today. But the election is scheduled for March 18th at the high school. It's a Saturday in accordance with our new normal in terms of voting. Springtime meeting, the warrant closes on Friday, March 10th. And the first night of town meeting is scheduled for April 24th. Construction projects, Eversource is working a little bit around town on the 345 kV project on Washington and Cross Street, trying to get them to clean up the Washington Street corridor a little bit and improve the pavement conditions out there. They are expected to start work on Lake Avenue in Woburn, which is right at the Horn Ponds area. Although it's not in Winchester, that it is very close to the Winchester line, and expect that there'll be some traffic impacts in Winchester. The traffic in that area will be restricted to one alternating lane during construction. So just be advised if you're headed that way. The 115 project is wrapped up for the year. I just wanted to mention that they, as we've talked about with the board in the past, they have agreed to install the speed tables on Woodside Road that were previously designed by Tool. So that work will be happening this spring. Main Street bridge railing repairs, we're still waiting for the precast bridge cap to be delivered North Reservoir Dam. They've wrapped up with the snow. They've wrapped up there, and they'll be back in the spring for final cleanup and planting. That project went very well. Transfer station renovation is moving forward. We're hoping to have the incinerator building demolished in February. That is pending. Eversource is scheduled for the installation of a transformer. So that has really been the holdup on a lot of the work that's been going on at the transfer station project. So I hope to have more information on that coming up. And then we have a few projects, as we've talked about before, that are coming up for spring construction. And I just want to mention 2 community events that are happening that are put on by the Winchester Coalition for a Safer Community. One is, both of them are regarding youth mental health. So there's a couple great events that they're hosting. I would encourage people who are interested to sign up. And that's all I had. To take any questions.
Any questions from board members for Beth? All right, hearing none.
Beth, we just need the appointments of the 2.
Yes. I only have one, Patty.
On the new, for the DPW custodian.
I have that one.
Oh, and then, you're appointing Julie Broderick. You just have
Okay.
to say that.
Okay, so I'll do the DPW first. In accordance with section 4-2B of the town charter, I've made the following regular full-time appointment in the Department of Public Works, Town Hall Head Custodian to Michael Donano of Derry, New Hampshire. When welcoming him to our town hall community. Our long-term custodian at town hall just retired, Bud Wallinger, retired last week. So I respectfully request that the board waive the customary 15-day appointment.
Great, is there a motion for that?
I move we waive the 15-day appointment period to appoint Michael Donano to the DPW Town Hall Head Custodian.
Second.
Roll call vote. John,
Yes.
Mariano,
Yes.
Mike,
Yes.
Anthea?
Yes.
I vote yes as well.
And then I just wanted to mention that I have appointed Julie Broderick to the open position on the Historical Commission that was left when John Clemson left last fall, and her appointment will expire on March 31st of 2023.
Okay, so a short appointment. Welcome, Julie. Okay, any questions for Beth? All right, hearing none, we'll keep moving. At this point, I'd like to open up to public comment. If there's anyone here for public comment in the audience, raise your Zoom hand and you'll be recognized for up to 3 minutes on topics on our agenda. Is anyone here for public comment?
No one has raised their hand.
Okay, seeing no one raising their hand, we'll keep moving along here. Next up, Hilltop Securities update. We have Peter Frazier here, our financial consultant. Peter, I appreciate you waiting a little bit for us to get to you.
Sure.
Thank you. And at this point, I turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And good evening, everybody. And I want to make sure I thank Beth and Mark for the invitation and the board for giving the opportunity to speak with you. Beth and Mark asked that I speak briefly about recent developments with Moody's Investors Service and the town of Winchester's AAA bond rating, which I'm sure, as everybody knows, is the highest bond rating attainable. Several months ago, Moody's announced that they were changing or making some changes to their rating methodology, and some of their new metrics flagged Winchester, as well as several other Massachusetts credits, as needing review, with indications that the AAA rating may no longer be appropriate and that a downgrade be warranted. Obviously, this created significant concern on the part of the town's management team. What was done was 2 meetings were arranged with Moody's chief Massachusetts rating analyst with the objective of first understanding the nature of the methodology changes so we could see how they're impacting the town's rating. And second, to have a full-blown rating review at which the town's team, including Beth, Mark, Meg, Stacy, Sheila, and forgive me if I've forgotten to mention others, but could make the town's best case for maintaining the AAA rating. On the first conference call, the Moody's analyst went through the changes that had been adopted and provided some comparative data, including national and Massachusetts AAA medians to show where the town's apparent credit weaknesses lay. Moody's identified a measure of the town's liquidity, essentially the funds that could be brought to bear to meet an unforeseen circumstance. Again, Moody's is most concerned about your ability to pay in full and on time your outstanding debt obligations. So that was one area of concern. And the other was looking at your combined debt, unfunded pension liability, and unfunded other post-employment benefits liability. It's also referred to as OPEB, as being sort of outside of the range normally seen for AAA credits. So with that knowledge, the second call was essentially the same sort of process that the town would undergo if it were issuing bonds. And every time the town issues bonds, there's this comprehensive review of the town's management team, the practices and policies, the economy, including sort of wealth, tax collections, where all the revenues are coming from, the finances of the community, the debt and contingent liabilities that I mentioned before. So that's sort of what they all looked at. Now, the entire finance team did a terrific presentation, and not to ruin the surprise, but the town's rating was affirmed. I should note that the efforts of your comptroller, Stacy Ward, may have saved the day in some respects, because when presented with the formulae underlying the liquidity metric that was of concern, that appeared to be weak versus other Massachusetts AAA municipalities, Stacy actually went and got audited financial statements from all of those municipalities, sort of tore them apart, and sort of reconstructed those measures, and discovered that apparently the town of Winchester's outside auditing firm had placed certain balances that would have been part of that metric calculation in places that were different than some of the outside auditors for the other communities. And once she discovered that and made adjustments for that, it brought Winchester's metric back sort of in line with the others. And the interesting thing about that is, apparently, and I'm not an accountant, but there's some discretion in terms of the treatment of some of these balances. So it wasn't a mistake, but what was very fortunate was that she went the extra mile to really understand and tease that out. And quite frankly, Moody's was very grateful as well, because obviously not only would they have been putting you in the wrong category had they downgraded you, but I think it also helps them now when they're doing this same sort of exercise with others, that they'll make sure that they're comparing apples to apples. So that was one of the issues. The other, with respect to the debt, excuse my man's best friend in the background. The other aspect with the debt, pension, and OPEB liability metric, the town made a very strong case that some of the actuarial rate of return assumptions for pension and OPEB were unrealistically low. And we, on the one hand, Moody's is faced with a number of different municipalities that have different actuarial rate of return assumptions on their pension assets and their OPEB, which can make the amount that you need to put in today in order to grow over time by that rate of return to meet the needs of either the pensioners or the retirees' health insurance at some point in the future. Not to get too deep into the weeds, but the thing was that Moody's was, we've been in a very, very low interest rate environment until quite recently. And so they were still stuck in this mode of using a rate that was unrealistic. Fortunately, they revised their thinking on that, and that too put the town of Winchester sort of back into the normal range with other AAAs. So the good news is, it was a scary patch there, but the town's rating is secure at the moment. And the other thing that I'd mention in terms of the debt metric is that incorporates the Lynch School, which hasn't been issued yet, but is obviously in the queue and is on Moody's radar screen. So they're aware of that too. That won't be a surprise going forward. And I guess from my perspective, the takeaway is one, you can never be too vigilant, and you've got a terrific team that is representing the town. But the other is that the town might consider, because, when the rating report was released, or the press release on this, they always for communities say, well, these actions might lead to an upgrade. These actions might lead to a downgrade. Obviously for you, because you're as high as you can go, the upgrade possibility is not there. But they did mention that, future declines in reserves or liquidity as a percent of revenue would be something that could cause concern or put negative pressure on the rating. They also mentioned material increase in leverage, which again is your debt, OPEB, and pension liability. And finally, if there were some sort of catastrophic economic event that could put pressure on the rating too. So from the standpoint of, if one of the objectives of the town is to, continue to create buffers against negative rating actions, perhaps considering continuing to add to reserves, and perhaps changing what is a relatively conservative revenue policy in terms of, or reserve policy, excuse me, and perhaps pushing that up a little bit, that target range that you've got. And, I think obviously you don't want to push it so high that you don't attain it, but pushing it up and sort of being vigilant there would be helpful. And I'm happy to entertain any questions. Lisa Driscoll, my associate, the senior vice president, who also works with Winchester, is on the line too. And between the two of us, we'll try to entertain any questions that you have.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
Sure.
Beth or Mark or Stacy or anyone else was on the call with Moody's. Is there anything you want to add to what Peter mentioned?
Just another gold star to Stacy for her work.
I'll
Thank you,
second that. I'll second that. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. It was driving me crazy why we were so low and everybody else was so high. So.
Oh, nice work.
Yep. Thank you, Stacy, for all your hard work on this. It's obviously, we can't do it without you. So thank you for that. Board members, any questions for Peter?
Yeah, I have a question on how Moody's is looking at the debt specifically, and if they're looking at debt that is excluded from Proposition 2.5, different than debt that is not that is from the paid from the general fund. The reason for that question is debt that is from the general fund. You could argue that there's a risk that we would stop paying it if we were to redirect that money to salaries or to something else. But debt that is excluded from Proposition 2.5, that's not revenue that we can legally use for anything else, right? So that's revenue that legally is raised on top of the regular tax levy and goes directly to pay that debt. So it seems like that excluded debt is a lot less at risk than non-excluded debt. And especially Lynch, for example, is going to be excluded debt, right? So do they look at that differently?
They do, although I think I would differ with your description a little bit in terms of Moody's, when they're looking at excluded versus non-excluded, it is more that you have the ability to raise the extra funds above your levy limit. That makes that attractive. In fact, there's no lien or superior lien on the exclusion portion. It's all coming out of the same bucket. It's only that you can put more dollars into the bucket with which to draw out to pay debt service. So it isn't, an issue where somebody has a different account with excluded debt funds or non-excluded, but it certainly, from the standpoint of the rating agencies, one speaks to, when they're looking at a credit, it is your willingness and ability to pay, and willingness is expressed by the Prop 2.5 override, that the citizens are willing to have their taxes raised specifically more than would otherwise be allowed for a particular project. So they like that. And they like the fact that there's more revenue there because, as you point out, if it's within the levy, you're constrained from one year to the next as to how much you can increase taxes in order to pay for all of the services, including debt service that's within the levy. So sorry to be so wordy here, but the long and the short of it is they don't rate either debt differently, but they do like the flexibility associated with the exempt. They also like the flexibility associated with self-supporting debt like water and sewer enterprise, because you have the town has the flexibility to raise rates for enterprise type purposes to whatever they need to be in order to service the debt and pay for operations, as opposed to the restrictions of Proposition 2.5. Does that make any sense?
No.
Yeah, that makes sense. So so that tells me, for example, the project at the transfer station, if that was on a separate fund that we segregated the fees for that would seem better in the eyes of Moody's than being from the regular tax levy, even if we are increasing the permit fees to match, because it's not in an enterprise fund. They don't see it that way.
Well, yeah, and it's really on the margin. When you look at and remember, Proposition 2.5 is a creature of Massachusetts, and they're rating communities across the nation where we have these restrictions. And so, and I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but for the audience, the idea is if you have a certain limit as to what you can raise in taxes, you're obviously limited in terms of what the expenses can be. And if you're adding debt, then you're maybe forced to restrict growth or reduce other operating budget line items. And so that's where that debt exclusion or an operating override provides relief and additional funds to pay for the services and the debt that the town is asking for.
So that leads to my last question, which is, given that Moody's rates a lot fewer communities in Massachusetts than Standard & Poor's, and given that we do have this Proposition 2.5 that is specific to Massachusetts, and a lot of the town's debt has been issued under debt exclusions that put it above the tax levy, would it make sense for the town to consider using Standard & Poor's for ratings versus Moody's?
Yeah, and the thinking, I think you've probably had your Moody's AAA since maybe 1944 or something. It goes way, way back. And not to wear anybody out with a history lesson, but Moody's used to be the only game in town. I've been doing this for 37 years. And Standard & Poor's came into Boston and pushed very hard to get market share. And one of the ways they did it is both the agencies look at the same information, but may weigh certain factors more heavily or not. They're providing an opinion. And over time, it turned out that Standard & Poor's would often notch, in terms of the rating, a community one notch higher than Moody's would. And so over time, folks migrated from Moody's to Standard & Poor's, but the AAA municipalities that have been around, sort of these legacy issuers like Belmont, like Wellesley, there's about 14 Massachusetts AAAs, and they never moved simply because, one, they felt really good about having a AAA from Moody's because so few other communities had it, and why would you dump someone if they are giving you the highest rating? So, you guys have stuck with Moody's. The only exception to that has been a couple of times when you've issued very large bond issues where the market is looking for sort of a second opinion, where it is financially in your best interest because of the size of the issue to pay for that second rating. But to your point, if Winchester was ever downgraded by Moody's, certainly Standard & Poor's would be there, and I would bet that they, unless it was catastrophic, that they would maintain your AAA. So at that point, you might have them as your primary. But as long as you can keep a Moody's AAA, I would suggest that you do it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Other board members with questions? Anyone? So Peter, I have a couple of questions. One, in the call, did we indicate as a town we would be doing anything financially that Moody's expects us to do, or is there a recipe that they want us to follow? Did they mention anything like that in the call?
Yeah, great question. But Moody's they'll tell you we don't make recommendations in terms of they don't want to be seen as saying you have to do this to get that. But clearly, the town's been through this so many times, and certainly we work with 180 Massachusetts municipalities. We've gone through this process that you kind of know what they're looking for. And one of the reasons you're AAA is because your management team's so strong and they know what Moody's wants to hear as well. And obviously the policies and practices that you've had in place or historically have treated the town very well. Obviously, you guys have such strength in terms of your wealth, your tax base, the growth in the tax base, your collections are really strong. The parts that they're seeing, obviously, pension and OPEB are pretty big numbers, and they're growing at a rate that may be greater than the organic growth of the town, meaning that, if your pension payment each year has to grow by 7% in order to get it finally paid off in 2029. That's putting some pressure on the rest of the operating budget because the rest of the budget, and I'm making it up, is growing at 4.5%. So those are the sorts of things that they're looking at. But traditionally, the town's management has been able to say, look, we're planning for this. We know what's coming. Here are the actions we're taking, and whether periodically you override Prop 2.5, as you did a few years ago, and a number of other highly rated municipalities sort of take that same approach, that, every once in a while we have to sort of top off the tank in order to continue to provide the level of services that our citizens expect.
Is there a formula, when you say top off the tank with overrides, is there a formula that other AAA communities follow? Is it once every 5 years, 3 years, or is it as needed? I mean, every year, in your experience, what is best practices?
I think, depending on the community, some communities that are very high growth communities don't need to do overrides because their organic growth is so strong. Other communities that are more mature, like Winchester, that growth, although you do have significant growth, it can't keep up. And so what some communities do, instead of coming and some communities do essentially an override every year, exclude all debt. Some think that, instead of essentially creating override fatigue, to be able to say to citizens, the voters, look, we're only going to come to you every 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, whatever it is, with a sizable override. And then that will give us enough in reserve to get us through the next 5 years, drawing down some of that surplus over that period of time. But I don't think there's any magic to it. It's more, if you have a story, and the town does a very good job of planning, both in terms of capital planning and being able to show what they're thinking the operational expenses are coming down the pike, and you've got a very good track record with successful debt exclusions and overrides, that the rating agencies are comfortable with a plan like that you can actually execute.
Okay. What about reserves? Is there any magic to what Moody's likes to see? For other how we spend it, or how we use it?
I know I'm taking way more time than I should, but with reserves, they're looking nationally because they have this rating scale that is applied to communities literally across the country, and those communities can be very different. In Massachusetts, we're a wealthy, relative to other states, a wealthy state. We are primarily dependent on real estate taxes for our revenues, and some state aid for some municipalities, but less so for affluent communities. And so that provides a lot of stability, and therefore you can get away with lower levels of reserves than other parts of the country. And literally in some parts of the country, the reserves to revenues in terms of a ratio might be 40%, which is really high. But it's because they rely on things like sales tax or energy taxes, things that can be very cyclical and very sensitive to changes in the economy. Whereas the real estate tax, and particularly, one of the upsides to Prop 2.5 is, regardless of what happens with the values, you get to levy whatever you levied last year plus 2.5% automatically, plus any value of new growth. So you, meaning Massachusetts municipalities, don't suffer the same sort of whipsaw ups and downs that other areas, and therefore something for the highest level communities, and we have some data that we can share on this with other AAAs, but typically it ranges from the sort of 15, 20, 25 is sort of the range for those AAAs. Every once in a while, some communities will drop below those areas, and then they'll get sort of the next round of whether it's an operating override or sort of controlling expenses to try to replenish those reserves.
Okay. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks, Peter and Lisa, for coming in. Really appreciate it. This is really helpful for us. I know you probably speak with the management team a lot more frequently than the whole board, so it's helpful for me. And also thanks to the management team for helping us, and especially Stacy for helping us keep our AAA. It's really necessary for the way that we do business, and that's a little bit my question. I know Moody's doesn't, make kind of policy recommendations or anything like that, but even with our AAA, the interest rates, that we see are still moving up. And do you see any headwinds for us in that, in consideration of that? We've been borrowing very inexpensively for a number of years, and it's just we've kind of gotten used to it. And without that there, our projects, especially with a long list of capital projects, are it's getting a little bit tough for us. I don't know if that's something that you can weigh in on.
Sure, happy to do that, and I may ask my colleague Lisa to throw in her 2 cents in terms of some recent sale activity. Just to sort of set the stage regarding that, a year ago, or a little over a year ago, if you were issuing 30-year debt, it would probably be less than 2% in terms of the net overall rate on that. And since then, with the advent of the Russia-Ukraine war, there have been a number of sort of disruptions, if you will, supply chain issues and other things that have created this inflation. And in order to combat the inflation, as you know, the Federal Reserve has been pushing up the Federal Reserve rate, which is essentially an overnight rate that banks lend to one another that are members of the Fed to balance their books. In any case, what the Fed does is push up interest rates in order to slow down the economy, to try to quash this inflationary pressure. And they've been doing it now essentially all year, and there are probably 2 or 3 more rate hikes in the offing. What's very interesting is, although the Fed funds rate is at around 4.5 now, what has happened is the long-term rates on bonds have not risen to the same degree. So right now, we're looking at long-term bond rates. I think we had some in the 2s and some in the 3s this week in terms of bond sales, 25-year bonds. And so we've got this weird inverted yield curve where short-term rates are actually higher than long-term rates. The other thing that has happened is there's been a little bit of a disconnect. Usually when Treasury securities issued by the federal government or outstanding get pushed up, municipal securities rates move in sympathy. But they aren't locked in terms of that spread between the two. And what's happened is, although Treasury rates have been moving up, municipal rates in some instances have come down a little bit, or as a ratio of the Fed rate has dropped from like 80% to 60%. So we haven't seen as much movement, which is good news for municipalities that need to borrow, because the shock, the sticker shock of going from a 2% rate to a 4% rate, when you look at the numbers on a big issue, that's a lot of money. Anyway, I'm way over answering your question, but the good news is right now, I think certainly if you were issuing 30-year debt for a portion of the Lynch School, it would be below 4% unless there's some sort of shock in the very near future. And when I look at the course of my career, when I got started, there were rates, were in the 15s for mortgage rates. And so, we're not anywhere near that kind of environment. And the last thing I'll say, I promise, is that what the Fed's doing seems to be working, because it is the markets are starting to believe that we're over the worst of the inflation and things are going to continue down and come into a more normal range. And I don't think normal is the 1% to 2% area, but certainly in the somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5, sort of would be a reasonable range, I think. Lisa, if you have any thoughts or contributions on that, please shout it out.
Yeah, well, just to add to that, just for information, I guess in terms of rates, the city of Newton sold, and they're also Moody's AAA, they sold yesterday 25-year bonds for about 18 million, and they got a true interest cost of a 2.99. So still, still under 3% there, which is great. And also the city of Concord, New Hampshire, they're rated a AA+ from S&P. They sold today 20-year bonds, about 13.5 million, and they got a 2.93. So,
it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world.
Thank you.
Other questions for Peter? Anyone else? Mark or Beth or Stacy, anything to add while we have Peter here?
No, I would just add, as we look towards our long-term planning, I think it's important for us to look at the overall operating reserve policy that we have. And as Peter's mentioned, we're on the lower end of AAAs, and as we look at, our 3-year plan and the possibility of going into an override, just building in what we think would be a prudent potential increase to that reserve policy as part of our long-term planning.
Noted. Okay. Well, if we have nothing else for Peter and Lisa, thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Appreciate all your work for the town as well.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Peter and Lisa.
Bye-bye. All right. Moving on, we have a letter that was in your packet, a communication to the ZBA, a draft proposal from, I guess it was from the board. I guess I would sign it. This came about based on just some feedback. I think some of you, I don't know who was on what emails, but I know Jay's here, that we received from residents concerning the ZBA process. Not necessarily the decisions made, but just the process and what they were following. And I think it's a good reminder that when we signed up new town council, one of the parts of their agreement was trainings for a lot of boards. And as we go through election cycle, probably great, as we add members to take advantage of those trainings. So I think Jay's team has been at the ZBA hearings, providing legal counsel, and as part of their ongoing process to train, all boards wanted to offer extend an offer to the ZBA about certain training as depicted in that letter. And obviously, as a select board, we kind of control that. So we thought it'd be helpful if we sent this letter, just reminding the ZBA that that's available and if they wish to take advantage of it. So I don't know if Jay or Beth or anybody has anything to add to that.
Rich, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So is it that the process isn't clear, that it's overly arduous, or the process is clear, but then it gets convoluted or just bogged down in a bunch of minutia, and then applicants are getting tortured beyond what is reasonable.
I don't know, Jay, if you want to answer that. I don't attend all the ZBA meetings or hardly any of them, so I don't know if I'm the best to comment on that, so. Jay,
I'm
if
not
you-
going to characterize what applicants are feeling or not feeling. Our concern, John, a little bit isn't so much with respect to the effort or the merits of any particular decision of the ZBA. We've seen a little bit of the ZBA kind of straining at the bounds of a process known as site plan review, which is generally a non-discretionary process that is intended to shape projects, but not to serve as a more rigorous special permit process. Sometimes, and it's not unique to Winchester, the line between those two processes blurs a little bit. It's complicated. There's a number of overlapping bylaws, zoning bylaws in the town of Winchester. And we just felt, after speaking with some other folks and looking at some of the projects that have happened, that maybe we could be of some assistance in kind of not so much a boot camp, but just going through methodically the different forms of relief that the zoning board offers and trying to delineate kind of where and how the zoning board may approach those in a way that kind of functions the way the zoning bylaws were intended. So
Jay, from what I understand, there's been a certain sentiment amongst former ZBA members and residents that there's a certain amount of overreach going on over there. I have witnessed it. I don't know it, but I'm wondering if it's helpful to reacquaint everybody with what their roles and responsibilities are, and that here's a box, you're supposed to live in it.
yeah, I think
you're being nice, but
right. They're a knowledgeable group. Look, I think land use boards are never going to win popularity contests when they come in a process where there could be conditions on the approval, a long time lag, or a potential denial. So it's not like you're getting a lot of Christmas cards from people. That said, we do think that there could be some benefit, especially as it applies to site plan approval, which is a complex process, but I wouldn't call it overreach. We think that there's some opportunity for kind of defining the outward bound of that process and perhaps offering some cues to maybe expedite it in the way that it's intended, because it is intended as something lighter than a special permit. That's why towns use it, is so that it's non-discretionary and it's not intended to deny a project, but just to shape it. So again, I have a lot of respect for the thought process and the passion that zoning board has. And, we think that we've seen a lot of zoning in our time, and we think that maybe we could help. And it's not just the zoning board. We stand ready to help the Conservation Commission. The chair and the staff over there have been great about taking our advice. I work closely with the DIOB and the planning board, and we help shape their processes whenever we can. So I'm not trying to single out, or no one's trying to single out the zoning board. It's something that we would do for any board, offer trainings. And it's not even limited to zoning. I was talking to Mary Ellen today about how we could perhaps improve upon open meeting law stuff. And we're trying to find a date for seminars and that. So as Rich said, that's what we're trying to offer across the board, land use, non-land use, for all kinds of trainings, seminars, updates, things like that. And I think the zoning board is just one board that kind of was in the queue, so to speak, of boards that perhaps we could be helpful with.
Great.
Mike, give your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I'm supportive of the letter. I think it's good to open up a dialogue with the Zoning Board of Appeals. Some of the processes have changed, and I've attended some meetings, and It's definitely a departure from what I'd seen over the years. And, you know, it's a product of a lot of transition in a lot of boards and committees that we see. And so it's important for us to kind of reaffirm the values of the Zoning Board of Appeals and why we have residents in those roles, right? It's to kind of facilitate a process against, you know, with your peers reviewing you, and not necessarily a litigious or a judicial process where somebody is passing, you know, judgment on someone's project or trying to stop it or trying to move it forward. I think it's good to reaffirm that, you know, there's agendas really need to be set aside when you're a member of the ZBA, and the process needs to be open and fair. And so I think it's good for us to have that conversation as it is with any of our boards or commissions, and for us as well. So thank you in support of the letter.
Any other thoughts or questions about this letter? Is everyone okay with it being sent?
Yes.
Anyone else? Okay. Do you want to take a formal vote on it, or are we by just consensus okay with it going out? Everyone's microphone still working?
It's said, man.
I move that we support the letter as presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
I'll do a roll call vote. Anthea?
Yes.
Mariano?
I'm abstaining.
Okay. John?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
I'll vote yes as well. All right, so we'll get that out. All right, next up on the agenda, and really kind of the main crux for our meeting tonight and the time we have remaining is to discuss, you know, FY24 budget, capital plan, long-term financial plan, ARPA funding. Just by way of background before I turn it over to Beth, I know staff's been working very hard over the last 3 or so weeks since we met on the 7th. And kind of took the policy directions that we gave at the start of the process that day, and kind of you know, been working numbers, you know, going back to department heads, talking to the school department, and kind of seeing what, you know, options they can present to us to, you know, further the process along. So I appreciate the hard work of Stacy, Mark, and Beth, and everything they've been doing behind the scenes these last couple of weeks amongst their other tasks. So thank you for that. And at this point, I think, Beth, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'll share my screen and just walk through some of the analysis that we've been doing to date. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So when we met on the January 7th, we got some direction from the board in terms of the desire to look at ways in which we could increase our revenues a little bit, just go back and kind of relook at some of the assumptions we made. And then also to come to the board with a scenario that would get us to zero use of free cash for FY24. So the first thing we did was take a look at our local receipts. So this is the information that you were presented with on the 7th. This column, second column from the right-hand side, shows where we were when we met on the 7th. We went back, excuse me, and adjusted our numbers a little bit. This is actually where we landed a little over a week ago in terms of our revised assumptions. So we bumped up the motor vehicle excise tax number a little bit. We bumped up the meals tax a little bit. We bumped up the fees a little bit. And we also bumped up the fines and forfeitures. So we basically found another $260,000 in revenues just from the local receipts piece. Any questions on that before I move on? I can't see everybody, so just shout out if you have any questions along the way.
I think this is kind of what I think I brought this up at the meeting. So, you know, I just wanted you to take a harder look at these numbers and see if there's anything we could increase. So certainly, you've done that. And is everyone on staff comfortable with these assumptions?
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
you know, in talking with Stacy, we look at the end of the day, when we do the tax recap, we're looking at the bottom line number. So I think overall, we're comfortable with where we land.
Okay.
So my question was, is there a reason that the licenses and permits is 200, is like 10%?
$1 million less.
Well, no, I understand that FY22 a special
Yeah.
with
Yeah, we
the
had
with the
Two
40Bs,
huge
but
40B projects, yeah.
the average prior to that 1.9 million, right? And we're
Yeah, so I think looking back, there were a couple years that really similar to 22. There were a couple very high years that skewed this on the higher end, which is why we ended up being a little bit lower. I don't have in front of me, I don't have all those. So we built this based on the 17 through 19 and 22 numbers. So it does get skewed a little bit by some of it. It includes 22, obviously. So that does bring it up a little bit. And I think, Stacey, I don't remember what you said, but we're just kind of meeting our 23 budget. We're like halfway as of December. I think we're just about halfway in our license and permits. We're kind of on target where we expected to be in 23.
And Mariano, I think we talked on the 7th just about, you know, the downturn in the real estate market, the development, you know, less building projects possibly going on because of that may affect it. So, I mean, certainly the market has cooled. So I think that's why they wanted to be a little bit more conservative in this number.
And also, I always take the conservative route when it comes to these local receipts, because when you do the tax recap, you cannot budget more than what you've collected in the prior year. So even though we might have been a little bit low on motor vehicle, it may have made that $200,000 would have made up for a pocket of money that might have been low in another local receipt. So we just need to be aware that when the time comes, when we close FY23, that we will revisit these and we may need to do some rebalancing, but it's as long as we're aware of that, we can certainly have time to plan and restructure a few things in the fall.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, that's one thing that is important to note, is that it is extremely conservative, because the risk of overestimating here is much larger than the risk of underestimating, right? Or the consequences, not the risk.
Yes.
Yeah, as long as we're aware that at the
Yeah.
fall town meeting, we could be faced with some cuts, say if our new growth doesn't come in. We've had some really good years with new growth, so it's hard to say that we're not going to get our 900 or our 950. But if in fact we don't, we have to find a way to balance the budget with, we can't really do much with real estate because that's capped. And the only other thing is state aid and local receipts. So yeah, we might have been a little bit low here and there, but I've had to balance some budgets in the past where we've had no money and no room, and it's a really stressful thing to do. But as long as we're prepared and we know to look, I look at that for water and sewer and recreation every year. We take a look at what they've collected, because it's the same constrictions with that as well. So if we're prepared, then we're fine. We should be fine.
I just want to make sure when we do the 3-year graph that we understand that these are like, extremely conservative numbers, right? And that we don't expect that it will really stay that low, that we expect reversions or revenue excess.
Oh, I don't think these are extremely conservative. I think they're pretty good. They were more conservative before. I think we're looking pretty good with these.
Yeah. All right. I'll go to the next section here. So in this slide, we basically, as Rich mentioned, we kind of went back on the municipal side to our departments, sharpened our pencils a little bit, and also went through with each department head where we could find some cost, more than just kind of run of the mill. Let's make sure we got the right number, and some of these are actual service reductions. So just at the top, kind of recapping where we are with the changes in revenue. So we actually, when we had talked at January 9th or January 7th, we were at 900,000 for new growth. We bumped that up by 50,000 to 950. I think that is probably the tippity top of where any of us feel comfortable, and probably Stacy's a little uncomfortable with the 950. State aid, we've kept it growing at 2.5% from FY23. We won't have those numbers with the new governor coming in until after the town manager's budget is due. So this is just an estimate that we'll keep in there for now. The local receipts adds the 269 that I talked about. And then when we met on January 7th, we talked about the new positions that were requested on the municipal side. So the first one was bringing on a full-time health inspector. Right now, there's a 19-hour position that they have not been able to fill in that department. And we've been using a consultant to help maintain those services. So the recommendation is that we increase that position from 19 to 35 hours, and we drop the professional services by 20,000. So the overall impact of that is just around $17,520. The next position we've talked about is the bringing on a second staff in our IT department. There is currently a position for a network administrator. That position was occupied when I started with the town 18 years ago, and just over the time has not been refilled. So we did talk on January 7th about looking to potentially reclassify that position, and we are working with HR to evaluate what that salary range is. I kept it at the tippity top of what that current salary range is, thinking that even if we did reclassify it a grade or step on the management schedule, this would still be within the range of, not at the very top of that next salary range, but it would be close to it. So if we brought somebody on closer to the top. In the treasurer department, we're looking to add a completely new position that we're calling a financial analyst. This would be a PT position that we would be looking to create at Springtown meeting. As we talked about on the 7th, we are trying to improve our online payment services for a variety of programs across town. And everything that happens in an online payment world gets funneled through and increases the traffic through our treasurer's office. And so we really need an additional staff person in that department to be able to make sure we can keep up with those needs. One of the other items we talked about was adding a part-time staff in the building department to help with potentially help with zoning enforcement, and also help with the large number of ZBA petitions that go through that department. Right now, we have a clerical position who handles those, bringing that through the ZBA, and it's a lot. And so I think it's certainly a department that could use some additional staffing. And then the one thing that we didn't talk about that we just worked out with the library director over the past week or so is they are looking to increase, they have multiple professional librarian positions, and they're looking to increase one of those from a part-time position at 15 hours a week to 19 hours a week. So it'd still be part-time, would not have full benefits, and that has an increase of about $7,571. So I'll stop there in case there are any questions from the board. I think one of the things I'm looking for, oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
As the payments go online, I get the need for an additional person, but the manual labor for different departments must go away. And so there's a lot less processing, unless we were sent to a lockbox and have a third party take care of those payments, which I don't think we were, because mine went to town hall. So does this allow us to economize in other positions or combine positions? Are we going to pick up, is there an economy of scale from doing this?
Sure.
I'm
Yeah.
all about making it convenient for the residents. That's cool.
Yeah, I think it's too early to tell. So a lot of this is like in the building department, right? We've moved to an online permitting system, and right now we were not able to implement the online payment piece of that because of this kind of inability, and not saying inability in a bad way, but just the reality of it, of the Treasury Department to be able to support additional processing. We still need a clerk in the building department, right? Even though she won't be taking the physical check for payments anymore, there is still a need to have a clerk in the building department to help with lots of other questions and permits and that type of thing. But there are other areas where I think as time goes on, we might be able to find some economies. I just don't think we're able to nail that down right now.
Thank you.
Sure. So I think from tonight's discussion, one of the things that I'd be looking for some overall policy direction from the board is on whether we want to keep this full list in. The total cost increase of this is just over $237,000, or we want to scale this back for the FY24 budget. And you don't have to answer the question now. I'm happy to kind of keep going through the rest of the presentation. We can kind of discuss it at the end. So just going back to the departments on the expense reductions, we did work with a variety of departments here, and I'll just run through these quickly. So police department, right now they have budgeted for 2 cruisers. That is not a capital expense in our police department. It's actually an operating expense to the need to maintain safe vehicles. So right now there's $116,000 in the budget. The recommendation is that we pull those out and we actually use ARPA funds instead to purchase those vehicles in FY24. So that would save us some funding there. And then additional recommendation is that we cut back one of the part-time parking clerks, which would save us about $20,000. In the IT department, we're looking to cut the new access points for wireless networks around town. This is a savings of about $22,000. It is also something we potentially fund using ARPA. Treasurer's office, we had a retirement of a long-term employee there. So we do have a little bit of cost savings with the new person that's coming on later actually in February, I believe. Historical Commission, we had been budgeting for $15,000 for matching grants for funds, which they won't need in 24. So we've moved that. The planning department asked for $80,000 in professional services to move forward with many of the rezoning initiatives that they're looking at in the Holton Street area and along North Main Street. So I have reduced that from $80,000 to $45,000, the savings of $35,000. Working with DPW, we were able to go through and reduce some items, and then in other areas reduce services for savings of a total of $85,000. One of the things that that they put up as a possibility is elimination of the summer help at a savings of $30,000. I think we all feel, in speaking with DPW, that that's actually something we like to try to preserve. It is for the cost of the town, we do get a significant amount of labor from the summer help, and it does help out with the activities that we do in terms of the schools and other activities around town with parks and other maintenance activities in the summer. So the goal is for us to working with the facilities director to try to find some other items in their budget that we can pull out and try to fund with ARPA instead, and then try to add this $30,000 back in for the summer help. But overall, I don't think it'll change the kind of bottom line of savings we can get through the DPW budget. The 2 other things I'm still working with the department heads on: the library budget. We're looking to see if we can reduce their books and periodical requests. Right now we have a reduction of about $30,000. And then I'm still working with the fire chief, who for obvious reasons, we haven't been able to spend too much time working through his budget, but I've tentatively plugged in about a $50,000 savings from his budget. And then finally, the energy budget, we just had got some better information than we had previously about our gas and diesel costs. So we were able to realize a savings of about just over $36,000 from where we were in our initial estimates. So all told, on the municipal side, including the energy budget, since we met on January 7th, we've been able to find about $428,694 in reductions. So I'm happy to take any questions on those.
Before we move on, a $30,000 reduction at the library seems like a lot. And I look at residents and the ones who don't have kids in school, even want to do it. But if you're an older resident, for example, that might be something you really value. And so is this going to be impactful? I mean, just $30,000 seems like a lot. And
yeah, so we're working with and that's why I flagged it. We're working with the library director to understand there's a minimum requirement that we must use every year and in order to maintain our certification in the larger library network. There's a minimum amount that we must put towards books and periodicals every year. And so we are just trying to understand this number a little bit. I do think there is some savings, and this is the number I received from the library director today, actually, in terms of what she was comfortable with in terms of a savings and reducing that number for FY24 and her request. But yeah, there is overall, I certainly understand the concern in terms of the reduction there. Any other questions on any of these items?
Yeah, Beth, I have just 2 questions. For the Wi-Fi access points, what exactly is that doing?
I am not going to pretend to explain exactly what that is. That was a request that was put in by the HR, or excuse me, by the IT director, and is something that he was looking at installing it in multiple buildings. And I think the question is whether all of the buildings that he was thinking of are actually ready for FY24 or not. But I do think this is something, and I've tried to highlight the ones in here in red that I thought could be potentially used. We could use ARPA funds instead. So that is something, if we felt, even before FY24, that we wanted to bring that back, it is something I think would be eligible for ARPA funding outside of the regular operating budget.
Thank you. And the other question was about the Parkhurst cleaners.
Yep.
I'm making an assumption that that would be just for the year. And
so
then it would shift because of Lynch.
Right. So the idea right now, there's an outside cleaning service who cleans the whole building. And the idea is, speaking with Peter Lawson, is that the outside cleaning service would instead just clean I guess where the preschool is. So I think it's kind of like the ground floor, basement floor. And that our regular custodians from Lynch would then move and clean kind of the other occupied space, including the modulars, while the school is being relocated there.
Okay.
Is where you have ARPA as the source of funding for a few things, is that related to the Washington and Swanton extra money from free cash at fall town meeting that we had said that we would fund forward for FY24 from ARPA instead?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the overall conversation of where we want to land, right? In terms of it's certainly that's a much bigger number, obviously, than what these few items add up to. But it is kind of was the thought process that we had kind of already discussed the concept of using some ARPA money towards the budget, and instead we would pull these items out, and the board could fund them directly using ARPA.
Yeah, because I mean that number was much larger than the. There's what 138,000 here, and
right.
Are we able to use ARPA to fund like the health insurance or part of health insurance for FY24?
So that's something we've been working through with town council. There seems to be a little bit of a kind of differing of opinion. Her preference is to try to fund, although I think maybe we've had a couple of conversations trying to find a workaround, but her preference, if we were to use ARPA funds in the budget, would be to fund something in the public safety budget instead.
Could we fund personnel expenses in the public safety?
Yeah, I'll let Stacy jump in, but I think that's possible, just a little bit more challenging on the accounting side.
I think where we landed with health insurance is that we could use it for health insurance costs associated with public safety and Board of Health. And we did an analysis to see how much that would cost. And it would be roughly like 1.3 million for the FY24's estimated costs of health insurance associated with police, fire, and Board of Health. So it's definitely something that we could work into the insurance budget. Pulling out the public safety salaries and personnel costs out of their budgets is a little bit more, I don't think it's tricky. We just will lose the continuity in analyzing like trends. Whereas the health insurance line, it's sort of like an easier place to have this blip in trends, but that's certainly something that we can talk about.
I mean, can we add it as a funding source on the yellow sheet, just so that we still have the total number?
You could, then it leaves it up to town meeting to change it if they don't agree with that approach. Like have the select board approve it and then put it on the yellow sheet and show that as an additional funding source, certainly. But there's the risk that the town meeting might want to change and move it around. But that's something to talk about for sure.
Yeah, because in the fall we talked to FinCom, right? And we said, that was part of the using some of free cash for the Washington and Swanton, was that we would use some of ARPA funds for FY24.
Any other questions on this one? I can move on to the next sheet.
Keep going.
All right, sorry, this one is a little bit harder to see, so I'll try to zoom in. So again, just the same revenue that we've talked about up top. And then this is a repeat of a handout that I gave you on January 7th. And what I did was in the 2 columns here is what you saw on January 7th. And then in the 2 columns here is what has changed based on all those items we just talked about. So this includes all of those new initiatives, and then includes the expense reduction. So basically the numbers in red are the numbers that have changed. And so overall, the total municipal departments, that the budget amount went down from 3.4, which is where we were on January 7th, to 2.86 increase overall from 23 to 24. The school budget, when we met on January 7th, we had talked about a possible range of 3.7 to 4.1%. The budget that was presented to the school committee last week had an increase of 4.48%. So I know the school committee doesn't vote on their budget until next week. So I'm not sure if that will be the final number, but that's the number that they have been discussing. Unallocated wages were adjusted based on the overall overall expenses up here. Energy went down, as I mentioned, because of the better numbers we got for the gas and diesel prices. And then the health insurance is really where we saw the biggest savings. So we actually had our meeting with our Maya representative on Monday, and our health insurance number, we had been budgeting very conservatively that we were going to see an 8% increase in our health insurance numbers. And we actually found out on Monday that we're not going to be any higher than 5.6. So that was a very welcome news. And so it's a little confusing because in FY23, we budgeted a higher number. As you may recall, we were not sure at the time whether we were going to be able to make the transition from Harvard Pilgrim to Blue Cross Blue Shield, which we ultimately did. So we saw a savings of about $500,000 in what we originally budgeted in the FY23 number. So that is kind of counted in here. So we basically took the FY23 number minus the $500,000 of savings, and then we added the 5.6% onto that. So the overall health insurance number is actually only going up by 1.57% in FY24. So that really does help us overall. And I think the 23 number and then, excuse me, the 24 number is not the trend. I think what we heard from our health insurance consultant, also from the Maya representative, is that we should expect higher numbers, which is why we had originally plugged in this 8% number going forward. So just to keep that in mind for the kind of longer term budget analysis that we'll do. Any questions on this before I move on to the next piece? Okay, so basically what I did, based on the feedback from the board at the last meeting, which was what would it take for us to get to zero free cash to be used. So again, here's the revenue assumptions, new gross stated local receipts. The health insurance assumes that 5.6% increase. These are the, as we talked about, the total possible new positions that could be added on the municipal side, and then the expense reductions. And so what I did was, this is the projected deficit, right? That was a level service budget. And I ran a few scenarios, which was the schools at 4.48%, which is the number that they presented last week. The schools at 3.7%, which is the number that we had talked about, the low end of the number that we had talked about on January 7th. And then I just ran a number that got us to 0% free cash, and that happens to be 2.65%. So that's where that came in. So this is the projected deficit, just kind of without any cuts, basically where we were on January 7th, but just adding in the new revenue. And then this is where we are at the bottom with this revised, including the municipal positions and including the expense reduction. So basically, we're at 0%, zero use of free cash, a slight surplus in 24 if the schools came in at 2.65. somewhere around $640,000 of free cash needed to be used to balance the budget if the schools came in at 3.7, and then if they came in at the 4.48, it would be about $1.1 million deficit. The one thing I just wanted to mention is we are still considering moving to Blue Cross Blue Shield for our dental and vision insurance as well. It would require us, right now we have Delta Dental, so it would require us to eliminate our Delta Dental program, but it would allow us to see a one-time 0.5% savings in our health insurance premiums, our health insurance rates. So we would actually go down from 5.6 to 5.1. So if we did that, there would be an additional $63,000 in savings. And we're still evaluating that with our HR department to see if that's a move that we want to make. But just wanted to mention that as well. So that's where things landed, and I'm happy to take any questions kind of on why I did this or how we got there. I will just very quickly go through the last slide here, and then we can go back to the other ones. So just kind of overview of where we are in terms of free cash. Free cash was certified last September at the $16.7 million number, which brought our operating reserves to 16.19%. At fall town meeting, we used almost $1.7 million. So we are currently, as of today, after fall town meeting, at an operating reserve of 15.03%. We do have an operating reserve model that we work with, and the assumptions that we put in assume that we'll have based on kind of historical averages, we'll have to use approximately $500,000 of free cash towards the snow and ice budget, as we typically do every year. We assumed there'd be other springtime meeting articles of somewhere around $750,000. We assumed we'd be using the $100,000 towards the capital maintenance account, which has been kind of the standard over the past few years. And then we assumed that we'd have about $1 million in turnbacks in FY23. So if we used just with those assumptions, and if we use no free cash for either the operating budget or to do a one-time allocation to capital, our operating reserve would be 14.79 at the end of springtime meeting, assuming these numbers are good estimates. But if we use $2.2 million of free cash, we'd be at 13.37. $2.5 million of free cash would be at 13.2, and $3 million of free cash would be at 12.7. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions on any of that. I think for me, the biggest items I'm looking for direction from the board on are, how we want to handle these positions that we've talked about as new initiatives, and then overall kind of where we want to come in terms of, do we want to hit no use of free cash? Do we want to look at putting some free cash towards capital instead, or where overall do we kind of want to land with recommendations for the budget going forward? Do you want me to leave this up if there's questions, or you want me to take this down?
I would take it down for a moment so
Okay.
we can have a discussion, and then we can go from there. Okay. Thanks, Beth. You can get a drink of water or something.
Yeah.
You're fighting it at the end, I could tell. Mariana, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question on the $1 million for turnbacks. That's much lower than like average, even pre-COVID. Like usually, I'm looking, we average about 1.4. We had years, of 2 million. Is the 1 million, are we just being conservative, or is that based on where we are actually right now on expenditures on the different departments? And so that's like a good estimate.
So I know like on the library, for example, they expect to be coming in under, because they have had some staff turnover and then just had some open positions. On the DPW side, they're having a challenging budget year, and we expect to be going to FinCom for a reserve fund transfer. So I do think it's kind of all over the place in each department right now. Stacey, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
No, not at this time. I don't. I think it's just more conservative than based on anything other than what Beth said about the DPW being tighter. They turned back $200,000 last year, which they're not going to have that this year. just based on what she mentioned about Pete and the repairs and maintenance and buildings, I believe is the biggest issue this year. So that's the answer.
And the other comment was on the, on the ARPA, right? And our Article 15 fall town meeting was what, 1.2 million, right? So I think 1.22 million. So I think that's what we had committed to FinCom that we would use on the FY24 budget. So, we can add that to that sheet so that we're not, using free, we don't have to use free cash, right? Even if we go in the middle column or even in the right column, right? Doesn't mean we want to go there, but right, we don't necessarily have to use free cash.
Okay. Yeah, so obviously, the question is, how do we use ARPA? What do we do? Obviously, the school budget is a big driving factor of this model. So, we talked about not using free cash, using our one-time funding to kind of balance the budget. But also, I think at the same time, we need to talk about capital, right? There's certainly capital needs out there. And we have a reserve policy that we should use them for one-time expenditures. So, where do we land with all this? I guess since everyone's a little sleepy tonight, I think I'm happy to kind of show you what I'm thinking and then just get some feedback. You can rip it apart, do whatever. And then we can kind of go from there if that works for everybody. So can I share my screen, Beth? Is that possible?
Yes, you can.
All right. Let's share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right. So here's what I'm thinking. My goal is to use obviously zero free cash and is use as much ARPA and free cash that we can to kind of address our capital needs. And I want to do it in a way that, obviously, doesn't hurt the schools and maintains, the municipal side as I think Beth and Mark and Stacy have done a good job of going through and sharpening their pencil and doing what, at least we envisioned on the 7th. To get us through this year. And then, next year, look towards some type of override to get us through the next 3. So we have the school budget at $63,630,167, which is a 4.48% increase. The school department has their $900,000 in ESSER funds, which amounts to about 1.4% of their budget amount. And we also have ARPA. What I was thinking is that we'd see if the schools could use their one-time ESSER funding that they're holding at $900,000. We would kick in $250,000 from ARPA. And Mariano, this kind of goes to your point. If we add up all these numbers, we're kind of getting towards what we said we would use to balance the budget. And that would give us about $1,150,000, so about 1.8% of their budget amount. If you subtract that from the 4.48, then the school budget increase would be 2.68%. So we would be able to balance the operating budget without using free cash. If the schools use their ESSER funding, we used our ARPA funding. That would allow us essentially to use our reversions from last year, which are around $2 million, maybe a little higher, free cash towards capital, consistent with our policies. And what exactly capital project, I think that's a discussion for a different date. If it's one project, if it's a series of projects. But that would leave us with 13.37% reserves. In that capital queue are several school projects, related projects. I think there's the facade of the middle school. I think that's $1 million project, Beth, if I'm not mistaken, and some others.
I think it's the Lincoln flat work.
Lincoln.
It's the like
Yeah,
1.2, 1.5 million in that range.
Correct.
Right, it's Lincoln, right.
And then, kind of long range financial / capital planning. We kind of talked about this at the January 7th meeting, would be an override in the fall of 2023, maybe January 2024 for an operations override for, the next 3 fiscal years, and also some type of capital planning as well, in order to kind of close that gap of, this cycle where projects are just getting expensive because we keep deferring them as well. We would form that state of the town budget committee and kind of follow the model that, I think was successful the last time we did something like this. So certainly, early on in the process, in the next, if we decide to go in this direction, but relatively soon, start that committee and really take a deep dive into how those fiscal years would work. We would identify additional capital projects for funding via ARPA. I mean, I think, when ARPA first came out, we were very excited. I think previous town manager made a lot of promises and sought input from a lot of groups. And I'm not sure, at this point in time, we're going to be able to deliver on a lot of those things. Just realistically, looking at what we have for capital, looking at, the budget and different needs of the town. So, we're going to have to prioritize, and I would focus on capital projects. That's just me. We will review and amend our capital policies and review and amend our reserve policy as well, as part of this process. So, I mean, I think that would be a longer range, a longer discussion. So I see these kind of as 2 parallel tracks. But I think that would, get us to a goal of balancing our budget, with the use of free cash, and hopefully, providing some necessary funding for the schools in order to meet their obligations. What I'll say at this point is I kind of see this right as the beginning. We're kind of looking for the goalposts at this point. And as we go through this process, things will become clearer. Circuit breaker funding, FinCom will be involved. So if we have the 2 goalposts, we can kind of negotiate in between them. But, I think at this point, I would like to start with the idea that we, use 0 free cash and kind of address our capital needs with free cash, and, kind of put something like this out there. So that would be where I would go. But certainly, appreciate your feedback and your thoughts as well. So I'll stop. If it's helpful, I'll stop sharing my screen. So get everyone's thoughts, and because I think Beth and the administration at this point, we're days away from, the town manager having to release their budget, the schools voting on theirs. Certainly want to work in collaboration with everyone, but I think we realistically need to understand that there's a lot of needs in this town from a capital standpoint, and we have a policy that kind of what we're supposed to be doing to address that. And I think this would go a long way to get start moving that capital queue as we go, and also allow us to maintain the level of services that the residents expect.
What's the policy, Rich, that you are talking about on capital?
Well, I mean, I'm talking about the 2000, I think it's 2018 policy where we, that we're supposed to use our reserves for one-time expenses rather than, to fund operating, the operating budget.
Okay, because we always used free cash before the override. We always used free cash to balance the operating budget, right? So I mean, when we look at the, historically, we used anywhere from 570,000 to $2.2 million in free cash to balance the operating budget. Prior to the override, of course. Once we had the $10 million override, we didn't need to do that. But.
Yeah, but I think
Yeah, I think you're going back to the operating reserve policy, which states that,
It's the third item here.
No, I understand, but I'm just saying it's not something that historically we've done.
I understand, and I think
Correct.
that's kind of contributed to the situation we're kind of in with the capital process. And I get why it was done that way, right? I mean, it's these are tough decisions to make, and there's only so much to go around. But I think with the gap growing with capital and items such as like the CPA, for example, not coming online for a few years, at best case scenario, I think we need to do something to kind of move these projects, because a project that costs $7 million today, in a year or two could cost 10. I mean, I think that's the trend we've been seeing. And the list is just growing. So I think we need to be more aggressive about that.
I understand. I just think it's something that we need to explain to town meeting that, for a long time, we didn't do that, right? We used free cash, which free cash comes from turnbacks, right? So it comes from operating budget money that was not spent, right? That's where free cash comes from. And we use that to fund next year's operating budget in order to avoid having an operating override, right? We avoided having an operating override for 10 years. And then that we're changing that mindset, but that came at the expense of not funding as much capital, right? Because the idea was that capital was supposed to be funded just from the stabilization funds. That the 2002 vote was supposed to be a one-time thing, and that just hasn't kept up. So that's something that town meeting's going to have to decide. We're essentially saying, well, we're going to spend $2 million on capital, and we're going to accelerate when we need an operating override, right? Because if we went back to how we were doing it before the $10 million override, and we said we're going to use that free cash to get us a couple of years of operating budget, then that means pushing off the operating override for a couple of years, right? So that's the trade-off that we're making here. Are we putting money into capital, but then we're making an operating override have to happen sooner? Or are we saving up those reserves and pushing off the operating override for a couple more years?
I think inevitably, if we're going to increase our reserve policy, and maybe we do that incrementally, I think we're going to need an override, sooner rather than later. And, if we're timing things out, I think this town could really benefit from the CPA. That would be in 2024. So it would be tough to have an override in that year. So I would prefer and recommend that we, target an override in the fall of 2023, no later than January 2024 before budget season, and go through the same process that, was successful in 2019. I think it was 2019.
Yeah, it was spring of 2019. Yeah.
Yep. Mike, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah, I think the objective of that particular policy is to show that if we have reversions in a particular year, we're not going to be adding to a structural deficit, right? So it may be that we, buy a fire truck that we need, and that expense doesn't continue in the following year, right? So it's not like we're adding to headcount, right, which is going to grow with us and create a further structural deficit. So, we're using free cash. We're converting free cash to capital. It seems like that could be a good plan in the long term, but maybe not in the short term for us when we're looking at, using reversions and free cash for capital, and then immediately going out for a capital override, and then immediately going out for the CPA, which is a capital override, right? So I mean, I just think we have to communicate with town meeting that we've got a strategy in place that is dealing with the operating side as well as the capital side. And I don't see cuts to the schools as a good option. I can't see the board supporting that, but I also am concerned with using any sort of ESSER money. I think that's for like learning loss and very specific, needs. I don't know that we can apply it directly to the bottom line of our budget like that. So I agree that we're in a little bit of a difficult position with ARPA because we've needed to use money for absolutely necessary costs and things that have been really important. But it's the wish list was long, and I think we do need to take care of some of these, plug some of these holes in our operating budget with ARPA. But I don't want to rely entirely on that, I guess, for things. When we look at using the ARPA for the police cruisers, it's not necessarily a savings, I guess. I mean, we're just using ARPA for, to plug an operating hole. So, I guess we're kind of deciding how much free cash to use, but at the same time, how much ARPA to plug a hole. I mean, the cruisers are difficult. They're really an operating expense, I guess, and they're recurring because we replace them so regularly. I don't know do we do like 1 or 2 cruisers every year, or I forget what it is, but I know.
So the goal is 2 cruisers a year. For the last 2 years, we've replaced 1 a year.
Yeah, and Mike, I think along those lines, I think it's going to be very hard to go to the voters in the fall of next year, or early winter, when the schools have $900,000 in ESSER money, and we have $4 million in ARPA money uncommitted, or we're still trying to figure out what to do with. So the idea is to use that one-time funding, and go to the voters and make our case, like you did the last time with 2 different budgets.
Yeah,
so,
I also think
in terms of the ESSER money too, I'm sure just like we maneuver around with ARPA and cuts, the schools could plug holes with ESSER and just kind of shift things around to make it work within the rules.
Yeah, maybe I have no idea. I don't know their budget that well, to be honest with you, but yeah, I mean, I think certainly we need to kind of address the ARPA issue and some of the capital priorities. And, I think also identify, if we're pushing the CPA, what projects that are in the capital queue would qualify, relative to the certain surcharge, right? It may be that at 1.5%, we can cover these projects. At 3% surcharge, we can cover these and get a higher match from the state. And, I just don't know. I mean, we haven't really looked at the details. And one thing that I think we should start with is looking back at the 2019 override and making sure that we met our commitments there with what we promised to fund, because it wasn't really a ton of things. So, but if there are things that fell off that list, then we either need to work them into our budget or have a justification for, why our need has shifted and how we've applied those resources from the 2019 override elsewhere. Because, we don't want people to say, hey, last time you told us you were going to do this with this money and we supported it, and then you didn't. And to that end, I would really hold off on any headcount increases, unless it's, by attrition, or as John indicated, from other departments that, we're decreasing staff need and we're increasing it on another side. So, I mean, I think we can work those increases in part of a future override.
I think the only thing I would say to that, Mike, is that we've identified these positions as, a need in order to start modernizing the town in terms of online payments and IT networking, that we really lack the redundancy in. We have one IT guy. If he left tomorrow, if he's out, we got people from the school to cover sometimes, but it's a real problem when you have this big of an operation with one IT person. So I think it's, we're kind of, we lack a lot of redundancy. And if you compare us to other towns, it's it seems silly. So I think it's long overdue. I mean, I don't think we're being greedy here and asking for these positions. Some of them are savings, like the health department one. It was a modest increase based on professional services that we use a consultant for, and it makes sense. And maybe our health collaborative could contribute as well. But it's I think these are imperative positions at this point. I don't think we would be asking for them if we didn't think they were.
I agree with that. And the few things, I mean, there was a longer list, obviously the departments put forward, and I think we tried to pick out the key ones, and the IT being, I think, really coming to a head in terms of critical need for the town. And then the treasurer position, it's hard to move forward with any of the initiatives that we want to do with the online payment systems until we have another person in place to help us with that.
So, I mean, I think the guidance Beth needs tonight is, and Beth, correct me if I'm wrong, is, what, from a policy standpoint, what are we looking, what should she be, targeting in her budget for, free cash use? And, I just, presented something where we don't use any free cash. But, is there a number that you're comfortable with? I mean, I think that's the guidance she's looking for to take this to the next step and start, further dialogues with the, our stakeholders, and see if we can make it work. Like I said, we're trying to find the goalposts here, and then kind of like any municipality or state government, and kind of negotiate a budget that way, and that can work for everyone. So it being 9:45 and hearing silence, I mean, are you comfortable with what I put forward, or no? What do you want to?
No, I mean, I think we need to put the 1.2 million from ARPA in there. We told FinCom in the fall that we were going to do that, and I think we have to live up to that commitment that we made.
I agree.
I mean, is that not in there? I mean, I guess I'm a little confused. I mean, we made that commitment.
No, and the direction I got from the board on the 7th was to bring forward a budget that used zero free cash or ARPA or any additional funding. So that's what this effort was to show what we would need to do to get to basically this zero number, with some savings on the town side, as well as, likely some cuts on the school side from where they would ideally be. So that's what this scenario represents. And then I kind of used the two other options from where the schools were a couple weeks ago to where they are today, just to show kind of the range on free cash, or what we would need to close the deficit, be either free cash or ARPA funding.
Now, just because we use 1.2 million of ARPA doesn't mean that we need to get it to zero. If we can get it to a positive of 300, that's great. And I say we put that into capital, right? Or we put that into reserves. But I think we need to have that there. And, if the schools have additional funding, also we could use that. As far as the 2 million, I mean, we always use some money for articles at Springtown meeting. I think we can come in a little bit less than 2 million. I think 2 million is a big number to use out of reserves. But if there's some specific projects that we can look at that is like $1 million, which is pretty close to what we expect in turnbacks, I think I would be comfortable with that. So Rich, that's from your, from what you showed, right? And I would like to see if we can squeeze an extra year out of the override. We told voters 2 to 3 years in 2019. We're now at 4 to 5 years. So it would be nice if we can go to the voters and say, hey, we're trying to squeeze as much as possible from it.
The only issue with that, Mariano, is that would probably run smack in the face with, a CPA vote.
Yeah. Understood. But, also I'm looking at we're having somebody tell us that that comparable communities are at 25% of, reserves, right? So we're looking at, at least having to go up to 15% in our reserves policy, probably. So, I don't want to spend 2 million and be at 13, right?
I'm not sure that's what he said. I think they were
He
all
said
over.
in other states up to 40%, other AAA Moody's communities in Massachusetts are as high as 25%. That's what I heard.
I think it's high, but I mean, I don't know if
Yeah.
Mark, Stacy, or Beth have any information of where we stack up in terms of our reserves and with other AAA communities.
Yeah, I think the range we're looking at is probably 8 to 15, and that's a wide range, but
Yeah.
trying to get it. We're 6 to 10 now, but trying to maybe widen the range, but increase the ceiling overall where we want to maximum where we want to
Yeah, Peter had recommended widening it, as Beth said, and we had talked about 10 to 14, maybe 8 to 14, something in that range. So
And
that's
then
a target for us to get to at a certain point, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to hit that number, and
We're there today.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, but I'm saying,
right.
including what we're, we're looking really at next year's budget, really at the, for that, I would say, right? I mean, we haven't really planned to set aside that money without an override, without an operating override.
Right.
I mean,
The
we're at
structural
15.
deficit.
We're at 15.03% with the $1.2 million spent at an Article 15 at fall town meeting. And with ARPA 1.2 million balances the whole budget, which was what was against Article 15. So there's no reason why we should be anything below 15%, except for whatever we spend in capital and free cash articles.
Right, and then I'm just saying for the following year, that structural deficit gets, significantly bigger, I think, for, us to handle, so that our operating reserve then dips down. So, I mean, it's fine. I mean, I don't want to promise that we're going to get to a certain level, but if we can, maintain 10 to 15%, and that's part of our plan with the next operating override, I think residents would be happy with that kind of, fiscal responsibility relative to the bond rating.
Yeah, I think it's important that as we look towards that override, we build in whatever the new range is that we want to target, so that in our overall long-term planning, we're planning for that new range.
In terms, just going back, Mariana, to your point about the 1.2 million ARPA money. I mean, I guess I'm envisioning that as just fulfilling capital requests that would be, either in the budget or, to kind of solve the capital crisis. I mean, that's the way I envisioned that money being spent, but
that's not what we said to FinCom. What we said to FinCom was that money was going to go into the FY24 operating budget to reduce any amount of free cash that we would need. The free cash was used in Article 15 instead of using it to balance FY24 budget.
And we could fund, a particular line item with that money, right? So I mean, that was the,
Yeah, if you remember, there was that whole thing that we were going to use ARPA money to fund FY23 health insurance. Instead, that was the original motion for Article 15. And then we redid that motion.
Don't remind us of that pain.
Sorry.
And part of the reason that we also, had put the operating override on with the Lynch project for the capital stabilization fund was really to kind of maybe try to address the traffic stuff, but also another, capital need, like one of the schools, roofs or something like that we needed to borrow for. So, I think I don't think we can in one swoop take care of all the capital needs, but I think we can kind of come at it from multiple directions if we can get a little bit here and a little bit there. And but I don't have a comfort level with just out of the gate just spending $2 million on capital unless it's compensated for somewhere else.
What do you mean by compensated somewhere else?
Well, I mean, if we're reducing the budget somewhere else and, we're making decisions about projects, I could see us making, decisions about, existing capital projects that are in the queue, and that maybe there's some savings for some smaller projects and larger projects. I just don't know. I mean, it's hard to say how much, to you that I'm comfortable using out of free cash, or of ARPA without kind of seeing, what we're getting, kind of putting it together. So, I don't know if the schools are what they're going to say, if they can be creative with ESSER. I don't know. We just have existing obligations, I guess.
So going back to Beth's slide, if the schools are at 4.48, the budget deficit's 1.1 million. I don't have the exact figure. Thanks, Beth. Go down. If you could just scroll down, Beth, to that.
Yeah, I was trying to make it smaller so I can show everything, but.
So it's 1.1 million. So is it the board's?
So I would just say that number would grow a little bit, because if the intention is to use ARPA to balance the budget, then
Right.
I'm gonna add back in the items that I took out that we would have used ARPA. So that number would be a little bit bigger. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're using ARPA to kind of replace the funding for those 428,000 that we've cut. So we'd have to put that back in. So we're still going to have a deficit of some variety, with that 1.2 million.
Yeah, I mean, some of these are true cuts, right? And then
Right.
some of them are, if you go back to this slide, certainly the two cruisers will get added back in. The IT would potentially, some or all of that would get added back in, depending on what Matt thinks he needs for timing. We'd have to have a discussion about the planning in terms of the request there, and then we probably wouldn't have the greater reduction in the DPW, because we wouldn't be offsetting some of those things out of their budget with ARPA money.
So I guess knowing all that, and even if we apply the 1.2 million, and I thought the conversation with FinCom was that we would apply to the overall budget, not necessarily the operating budget. Would we, do we still want to try to balance the budget without free cash, which would involve,
So essentially, if we add the $138,000 to the 1.110, we're at 1.248. And Article 15 was 1.22. So we're at a $28,000 deficit.
I think it's more than that. I don't know. So it's not much more than that, but I think there is, I don't know. What was the number you said, Mario?
So I added $138,000 because that's what in the previous sheet, that's how much was from ARPA, 116,000 for two cruisers and 22,000 for the access points.
Yeah, so there's a little, not all identified here. I think I had the possibility of trying to fund some of this, the planning studies that were reduced out of ARPA. And then, as I mentioned, the DPW, I was still working with them to identify ways that we could keep the summer help and instead offset that same $30,000 with projects that could be funded out of ARPA. So it's a little bit more than that, just those two items there.
Okay. But we're sub $100,000 in deficit.
Yeah, around that 100 to 200,000. So I guess is the policy direction. So knowing that, I mean, do you want to do that and, instruct management to balance the budget without the use of free cash, which would involve cuts, going to the schools, seeing if they can sharpen their pencil, or use some of their one-time funding? I mean,
How much do we have left in ARPA right now?
I can get that number. Just give me 1 minute.
But Rich, to answer your question, I would say yes. I would say let's balance the budget with the 1.22 and no free cash.
I agree, and see what the school can do with whether it's ESSER money or whatever they have. You know, if we're doing something on the municipal side, hopefully they could do something, and we're fairly close to being balanced.
I want to say we have around $4 million in ARPA, but if we use 1.2 million, then we're down to,
Yeah, we have 4.2 million left.
yeah, so we're down to 3, I think is what we would have.
We also need to prioritize discussing ARPA. I think maybe you had some of it on the agenda for today, but prioritize discussing ARPA and how we're going to use those funds when it comes back to the bigger picture of.
And Thea, we can't really hear, I can't really hear you very well. It's very low, sorry.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, I think it thought I was still on my earbuds. Just going back to ARPA and how we're looking at the remaining funds and figuring out what we are prioritizing that for and using that for, because if we think of the sort of longer term planning, as Rich has mentioned, we need to figure out what the remaining 4.2 or 3 million ARPA funds are going to be used for.
So we have just over 4.2 million now. If we use the 1.22 out of that, we'd have just shy of 3 million left. I mean, Mark and I in 10 minutes could tell you different ways to use the 3 million. The big question is how we're prioritizing the town hall HVAC project, which is currently somewhere around a $7 million project. And, you know, if we wait a couple years, that's going to be a $10 million. So I think that's the big one that there needs to be some kind of decisions made about in terms of timing and priority for that, because that could really change the direction of how we allocate funds for future projects. If we try to, you know, put a portion of this money towards that project and look at other ways to support it on the capital side, or how we go about funding that.
Yeah, so, all right, so we're gonna balance the budget without the use of free cash. We're gonna apply the $1.2 million in ARPA and see what the deficit is, and then sharpen the pencil, and hopefully the schools can sharpen their pencil as well. And then in terms of capital, you know, what are we, because I think this kind of goes hand in hand. What are we comfortable with, you know, using towards capital or recommending using towards capital from free cash? If anything. I mean, I threw out 2 million because I thought, you know, that would keep us at, you know, more than 13% in reserves. You know, I think with the remaining ARPA, that could, you know, I thought we have a little bit more remaining ARPA that we could put towards capital, but I can appreciate the position. I think that could make a huge dent in the capital queue and kind of move the ball with that.
I mean, we usually do capital in the fall after we know how much we have in turnbacks, but I don't know how everybody else feels about that.
It's just hard because it's an abstract conversation. I think we've been talking about reprioritizing capital or you know, changing our process to, you know, I think that's what FinCom has essentially been looking for us to do, is to look at the, you know, identify the highest priority projects and then put money. So 2 million, maybe that gets us, you know, roofs for schools and things that are, you know, a high safety risk and high impact, and that maybe it makes sense. But, you know, maybe there's some other stuff that are just things that we want to do. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe that's part of the exercise to say, but if you're saying 2 million, what would that be used for? You know, so. Well,
I think the town meeting would still need to vote on it in the fall. I think, but going into the capital process in the fall and how we, you know, look to maybe, you know, review those policies and amend as necessary, you know, that's going to add, you know, a significant amount to this, to the pot that's available. So they may look at things differently. I think ultimately what we need to get to with capital, and I think this is why I tend to favor an override sooner rather than later, that includes capital, is that we, kind of identify categories and buckets that we can, every year, commit to the town that we're going to spend a certain amount on for categories of projects, rather than, just, ranking projects and taking what, departments, put forth as their priorities, that we, spread the wealth to different buckets. And I don't know what those buckets are as I sit here today, but I think, we could probably come up with, 5 or so categories, 6 that, that would do that.
I mean, it seems like it would make sense then to look at our existing capital projects and take the 3 million remaining in ARPA and apply that to the capital queue and create some, capacity there for us. And I don't think anybody's going to argue that money's wasted from ARPA if it's spent on capital projects. I know Pete Lawson had mentioned last time that he was in that there, 3 school roofs that are in need of, immediate repair. And so that would be a priority for me. I don't know, but
yeah, I mean, I think we have our own list going with the town manager's office, what they've identified as, ready projects for ARPA that are, capital in nature. So, yeah, we can talk about it, but it's, I mean, I think, we've tended to fund ARPA capital projects that, have, may not see a very good response through the capital process, but may, do a great service to the community. So.
Yeah, I would just mention the Leonard Field, the board had funded the master plan project, which we've just in the past week gotten some concept plans back from Chris Huntress. So I'm happy to bring that to the board at a future meeting to talk about the options we have there as we look at the overall picture for the ARPA funding. I know that was one of the ones we had talked about previously.
Yeah, and I don't know if that would be eligible for CPA funding as well. That's what I don't know. I mean, it would be nice to just go through all the list of these capital projects. I didn't just circle the ones that we believe are eligible for the CPA and then circle the ones that are like, roofs for schools and, whatever else is, necessary, and really focus on health and safety and tackle it. It may be that we spend $3 million from ARPA just on those needs, and maybe we also need to spend $1 to $2 million from free cash on those capital. I just don't know. I mean, I just haven't seen the list of priority projects.
I think the only issue with that, Mike, is that, costs go up and, CPA projects, won't be eligible at the earliest of 2026. So, I mean, it's a long time to wait. And then when they are eligible, what do we have, what's the amount we have available to fund those right away?
I'm agreeing with you, Rich. I mean, I just said maybe spend 3 million on capital from ARPA and 2 million from, free cash. I just don't know on what, right? So there certainly are things that, could be funded by the CPA that are, not necessarily on the emergency side that would fall into the category of that. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd have to see a list. I guess I have to see like what it means to fund and, without our budget, without free cash, what's left over, what that would be used for, and go from there and see what the schools can come up with as well for from savings if they can apply ESSER to any of this, any of these needs.
Okay. Other thoughts? So Beth, do you feel like you have direction that you need at this point?
Yeah, so I mean, I think overall, I'm looking to bring in a budget that doesn't have a deficit greater than 1.22 million. And that full 1.22 million will go towards, will be taken from ARPA. That seem reasonable? And I will, you know, I'm going to strive to include all of those new initiatives on the town side in that list. Unless I hear otherwise from the group.
Driving's good.
All right. And then on the capital side, are we giving Beth any instructions at this point, or? Sorry, I've been up since 4:30 this morning and I've driven to the western part of the state, so I'm starting to fade a little bit here, so. And came back before the giant snowstorm. So, what, in terms of ARPA and capital, do we want to kind of lay out options, you know, with the 3 million left in ARPA and, you know, what 2 million may be able to be spent on from free cash and come back at our next meeting and talk about it?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And also, you know, what we're not funding based on the ARPA requests that were out there, right? Because, you know, if we're just forsaking the entire, you know, queue that was requested, I mean, that might be, you know.
She would be.
Yeah, that would be a bad idea as well. So.
We can go through that list again and see.
Not tonight, but I mean, so. Maybe in conjunction with.
I think it's only like 10 pages. We could start and be done by 11. Come on.
In terms of long range planning, because I think, you know, when we talk to some of our stakeholders, especially the schools, you know, targeting override for the fall of 2023, January 2024, you know, for operations and capital, I mean, is there an appetite at this board to do that at this point? You know, to kind of further those discussions, because I think that's going to affect, you know, if I'm the school department, for example, I think that affects my thinking a little bit, knowing that, you know, this override could come next year. So maybe it's a one-time hit I take rather than, you know, something, you know, 2-3 years down the road. What's the appetite on this board to kind of explore that and further that strategy?
I think we need to look into, you know, into that strategy, look closely at the timeline. I think we've discussed it a bit today, but if we're being really aware of how that aligns with CPA funding so that, you know, folks are not hearing an appeal very close together, and kind of us making sure that we're able to secure sort of a big piece of the CPA with matching funds down the road as well, because that will, you know, as we were just talking about, makes a dent in capital for what we're looking at.
So in terms of the CPA, my guess would be, and Mike, Anthony, you know, maybe a little better than me, but we would present it at the spring 2024 meeting and then have it on the ballot for November of 2024. So, you know, whether you do an operating override and, you know, if you can wait till, you know, spring of 2025, you know, it would be sandwiched around that, or you did it before in the fall of 2023. It's kind of the nature of it.
So this is I had put this together very quickly for the meeting on January 7th, and most of it still holds true. So obviously we just had the Lynch override. Looking at the CPA, so CPA would come to Springtown meeting in April, May of 24, and then it would be placed in the ballot in November of 24. So if we were looking for a operating override for the FY25 budget, it would be sometime either fall of this year or January of 24. If we push that to FY26, we would either have it on the same ballot as the CPA, or it would get pushed to January of 25 right after the CPA vote. So just that's a possibility of overlapping those two overrides on the same ballot if we waited till, a year later.
And I'll just remind everyone, why CPA is kind of controlling a little bit here with this idea is because we've been given guidance that the presidential election is typically the best time, the most effective way in terms of trying to pass a CPA. Am I right to say that, Mike? Or Anthea?
That's right. Yep, that's our understanding.
Yep. So that's why I was shooting for next fall, because I think it also, it helps us with our I don't think we can stretch it till after the CPA, let's put it that way. And I don't think it's a good idea to have it with it. And I think the need's there. I mean, the last one was in 2019. It lasted, it was supposed to last for 3 years. It's lasted for 5. So I think we have a good story to tell, when we go to voters in the fall. My only concern with that story would be if we still have one-time funding available. So if that's earmarked and gone as, towards capital and other areas, then great. And, we can explain what's left and what remains. And I think that's a good story to tell as well. So, especially if we're revising, some of the policies and procedures around it.
The question was, should we explore it? My answer is yes. Right? It's 10:15. It's a binary answer.
No,
Well, I
I'm
guess
just
we say
waiting for that
maybe,
answer.
right?
I mean, I'm just waiting to see what people think.
All right, this is my answer.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
That's all right. We're up since 4:30. Come on, trying to be sympathetic.
Are others okay with that or no? I mean,
We have to do it, right? I mean, we for capital for a whole bunch of reasons. I don't really see how we don't do it. I mean, I hear Ryan saying about pushing it off. I mean, in ideally that'd be great. But if we have like this infrastructural issue, I don't mean from a capital standpoint, just from a budgetary standpoint, then we should address it sooner than later. Plus, you don't know 2 years from now what the economics are, and people have less of an appetite to pay a higher real estate tax bill. So that's why I think there's some immediacy to it. We may decide not to do it, but to fully explore it, I think we should.
any other thoughts on that? Okay.
So that's
If you would like first.
What?
I think it is something that we need to start looking into in terms of how we take a look at the long term, especially with the sort of short diagram Beth just shared and how that works out in timing.
So if that's the direction we're moving, I think we need to think about the kind of group we're going to put together. The last time there was an override contemplated, there was a working group that was put together with various board and committee members. I think there's a longer timeline to get to the override vote than we're looking at here. So it is kind of important that we start that process sooner rather than later if we're really trying to get something to the voters by the end of 2023, we're quickly losing time here in terms of being able to put something together and then have time to explain it to people what the plan is.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the length of that process, and Mariano can speak a little bit more to this, was creating, a conversation and a way to talk about the budget with residents. So they understood that there's structural deficits, built into our budget process, that nobody made a mistake, nothing happened. And this is just every, 3 to 5 years that it was going to happen. So I think a lot of the creating that language and that process was a lot of the work. And I'm hoping that this next, state of the town committee, it won't take as much of the the initial process part. But I don't know, Mariano can speak more to that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we went, we had a presentation and, it was like an hour and a half presentation. Well, with questions and answers, it was like 45 minutes of presenting. But I don't know, we presented it 10 times maybe. I mean, we had it at the Jenks 2 or 3 times. We had it at schools. We presented to all the different PTAs. It's a very time-consuming process to get an override through. Now, granted, that was a $10 million. Originally, it was a $17 million override, then 12 million, and then we ended up at 10. But we had a special town meeting to get feedback on because we went into special town meeting with 12 million, and then after the special town meeting, we got it down to 10. So it's a long process. And it requires making 2 budgets, right? Or 3, well, multiple budgets, but yeah.
It was 3. It was like
3.
Austerity, just as
Yeah.
is, and then a wish list, yeah.
And we had 48 versions of the spreadsheet. I remember that we ended up at revision 48 of the spreadsheet. So it is a long process.
I forgot about the town meeting we had, that special town meeting. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
So to that point, I would want to start this process sooner rather than later. So
I don't think we need to spend down the free cash. I mean, we went into that override with I can tell you 12.
I'm not suggesting spending down the free cash, Mario. I'm talking about ARPA and
yeah, the ARPA, yes, absolutely. But we went into that override with 12.25% reserves.
Yep.
So over our target.
All right, unless anyone objects, we'll start heading towards that direction. I'll take silence as you're abstaining or you're in support.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Anything else, Beth, we need to do in terms of budget for you tonight?
Not in terms of budget, just the one ARPA request that we did have.
Okay. And was that the $10,000 one?
Yes, so we engaged a consultant to help us do a risk assessment study on the town hall. And one of the things they identified was the lack of lighting, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anybody who has come and gone from night meetings at town hall. So we got a proposal from an electrical engineer to help us put together some construction documents to improve the lighting. The request is for $10,000 just to cover the cost of the engineer. There'd be an additional request for the construction piece once we have a better idea of how much that would be. But we'd at least like to get this started so we can either take it to capital or ideally get ARPA funds to complete the construction, because I do think it's a concern, and I think it should be a priority for the town to increase the safety around the town hall building.
Any discussion on this? Any issue with this? I mean, I think it makes sense. Someone who attends night meetings there, it is really dark, so I think it's a safety issue. All right. If someone wants to make a motion, we can vote on that.
Lots of ARPA funds for a security design for the town hall lighting project.
Second.
Roll call vote. John?
Yes.
Mariano?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Thea?
Yes.
I vote yes as well. All right. And then we have committee appointments. It looks like we've got Helen Filio to reappoint to the Capital Planning Committee. And then the constables. Anthony, we're having a little trouble hearing you. I don't know if your earbuds died.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. They died.
Then we lost her again.
Oh, we lost you again. Is
How
something
about now?
good? Yep, we got you.
Okay. So I move we reappoint Helen Chow to the Capital Planning Committee for the term to expire January 1st, 2026.
Second.
Any discussion on this? All right, hearing none. Roll call vote. John,
Yes.
Mariano,
Yes.
Mike,
Yes.
and Thea?
Yes.
I vote yes as well. And then we have 3 incumbent constables to appoint for a year.
Do we need to do these separately or can we do them in one motion?
I think we do them all in one.
So I move we reappoint Jack Celia, Stephen DeRosa, Jeffrey Wolf for constables for the term to expire November 30th, 2023.
Second.
Roll call vote. John,
Yes.
Mariano,
Yes.
Mike,
Yes.
and Thea?
Yes.
I vote yes as well. We have a consent agenda.
And I move we
Questions
approve
on
the
that?
consent. Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
Hearing no questions, go ahead.
Move we approve the consent agenda as printed for Monday on the Monday, January 23rd, 2023 agenda, or Wednesday,
Right.
January 25th.
25th.
Second.
Roll call vote. John,
Yes.
Mariano,
Yes.
Mike,
Yes.
and Thea?
Yes.
I vote yes as well.
Can I, now that we can hear Anthea, I don't, Stacy hasn't said anything, but on the ARPA motion, can you repeat that? Did you actually say the $10,000 or did you say any money at all?
I did say the $10,000.
Okay.
Are we good with that?
Yeah, Stacy's not,
Yeah, fine. It was very low, but I was
but,
really
okay.
listening.
That's what I want to make sure.
Sorry, I fully blame technology.
Is there anything else we need to discuss tonight? Or are we all set? All right.
I think that's it.
All right. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Roll call vote. Mike,
Yes.
Mariano,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
and Thea?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. All right. Thanks everyone for your time. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
Night.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you.
good
Good
night.
night.
Everybody have a good night.